teachers by machines may seem inadequate or even intolerable, but it is probable that these narratives are already no longer the principal driving force behind interest in acquiring knowledge. So, to break this down, and this is how it relates to my paper. Firstly, Lyotard's outlining here the historical confluence between techno-capitalism and the era now considered postmodern, which of course we can argue is behind us maybe it's coming to an end, who knows, we've got this up for debate. Secondly, the association of the grand narrative, this idea of the spirit, something larger than ourselves, which we associate with pre-modern or modern conditions of knowledge. So that might be a religious kind of moving towards some great opening of human futures, or I know something teleological, something that drives us from above and beyond. Okay? And thirdly, Lyotard's outlining the idea that the relationship between the human and machine, computer software, is generally one-sided. So he believed that, okay, it feels funny to put our children's education in the hands of computers, but as long as those humans, those students know how computers work, then they'll be okay. Yeah, they'll be able to get by. Okay. So today, Lyotard's vision of an informatically literate populace has more or less come true. So this is kind of a distributed thing. You know, in California, we have the world's first algorithm, computer-driven cars on the roads, whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, people are using technologies in the West that we were using in our mobile phones maybe 10 years ago to aggregate their crops and sell them on the world market for greater amounts, so they can bring together their value. Okay, so this is, techno-capitalism is spreading, but it's not spreading evenly. But we can agree that a huge swathe of the human population at some point is interfacing with these technologies, touching simple mobile phones, screens. We're more and more interacting with these as techno-capitalism spreads out. Okay. As Brian Masumi remarks, network technology allows us the possibility of, quote, bringing to full expression a prehistory of the human, a worlding of the human that marks the becoming planetary of the body itself. Okay. So this worlding of the human represents what Edmund Berger argues is the death of postmodernism. He says, the largest bankruptcy of postmodernism is that the grand narrative of human mastery of the cosmos was never unmoored and knocked from its pulpit. Instead of making the locus of this mastery large aggregates of individuals and institutions, class formations, the state or religion, etc., it simply shifted the discourse towards their individual selves. Okay? So it promises human beings a modular dream world that we can participate in. No more do we have grand narratives, but the narrative is individual. Okay? These algorithms are for us. Techno-capitalism can help us, save us, make our lives easier. So algorithmic narratives appear to continue this trend. They are piecemeal, tending to feed back users' dreams, wants and desires through carefully aggregated design package narratives for individual use. A world not of increasing connectivity and understanding between different people, different kinds of understanding, but a network worlded to each individual's data, each individual's perceived wants and needs. So Elie Pariser talks about this in terms of the filter bubble. So we go on our Facebook stream, our Twitter stream, we tend to see what we want to see. We tend to like things that we want to like, and the algorithms then feed back that world back to us. We close ourselves in to our own little narrative world, our own story of our own selves. Yeah? Just need a drink. Okay, so as algorithms develop in complexity, the stories they tell us about this vast sea of data is tending to become more and more enamoring, more and more palatable. Like some vast synthetic evolutionary experiment, those algorithms that devise narratives we dislike will tend to be killed off in the feedback loop in favour of other algorithms whose turn phrase or ability to stoke our egos is more pronounced. So narrative science, for instance, they found out that their original algorithms for the Little League games tended to focus on the victors of the games. But parents don't want to just hear about who won the game. They want to hear about the little successes that happened in the game. They want to hear about the one kid who did that long hit and managed to get to the fourth base or whatever. They don't care necessarily about the victors. So they change the algorithms to suit this. Again, they move the algorithms around to suit each individual parent's wants and needs. So again, to quote the chief scientist Chris Hammond from Narrative Science, quote, "These are narratives generated by systems that understand data, that give us information to support the decisions we need to make about tomorrow." So whilst we can program software to translate the informational nuances of a baseball game or internet social trends into human palatable narratives, larger social, economic or environmental events also tend to get pushed through this algorithmic meat grinder to make them more palatable to ourselves. So the tomorrow that Hammond and Narrative Science claim his company can help us prepare for is one that presumably will have more companies like Narrative Science in it. Okay? This is good for techno-capitalism. This is a tomorrow that they're invested in, we're invested in. Good for everybody, good for profit, good for the user. All right? In her recently published essay on crisis and the temporality of networks, Wendy Chun reminds us of the difference between the user and the agent in this assemblage. So she says, celebrations of an all-powerful user agent, you as the network, you as producer, counteract concerns over code as law, as police, by positing you as a sovereign subject, you as the decider. An agent, however, is one who does the actual labor. Hence, the agent is one who acts on behalf of another. On networks, the agent would seem to be technology rather than the users or programmers who authorize actions through their commands and clicks. So again, the agent here is not maybe even the programmers, it's not us, it's the functioning foundation of capitalism itself that's pushing these algorithms the way that they go. These things are good for profit. These things are good, they propagate themselves. So the programmers tweak them so that more people buy them, and the users respond to them to increase their sense of well-being and goodness in the world. Okay? We see this again in Facebook's newsfeed algorithm, and kind of these Amazon things. We just see what we want to see. Okay? So I'm coming to the end now. Okay. So I want to finish. I just want to gesture to something bigger, and this is really a gesture. I'm just kind of opening this up. Okay. Essentially, not all the information out there, the big data that is coalescing, is going to be palatable. There's some bad things in the data that are coming. Okay. These aren't going to tend to get shifted through these kind of narrative systems because they're not good for capitalism. So one of these things is, for instance, climate data. Without the ascension of computers and all of these different connected devices, we wouldn't understand the climate the way that we do now. All of these crazy, distant, and complicated effects that are happening are being subsumed into big data. But algorithms like Narrative Science, algorithms that are run by companies like Facebook, they're not going to turn these into narratives that are good for us, okay? So, okay. I'm just going to read... Well, no, I'm not going to read this, okay. Okay, so never before has humankind had so much information to help us make decisions and help us enact changes on our world, our society, and ourselves. But the problem is that some of the stories big data has to tell are too big to be narrated, and they're also too big to be palatable. So, I would argue that the grand narratives of legitimation that Lyotard claimed we've left behind in the move to postmodernity might need to return in some way if we are to manage big data in a meaningful way. Crises such as catastrophic climate change will never be made palatable in the feedback between users, programmers, and techno-capitalism. Instead, we need to revisit Lyotard's distinction between the true and the useful. Rather than ask how we can make big data useful for us to further our own narratives, we need to ask what grand story we want that data to tell us. Okay, that's it.
Great. Can I grab that? Oh. Thank you, and thank you for staying on time. Next up, we have Natalie Kane, ND_KANE on Twitter. She'll be speaking about ghost stories today. And maybe this is a follow-up from last night's magic and conversation last night. Natalie is a curator, an artist, a researcher whose art explores the intersection of culture, design, futures, and technology. She works at Future Everything in Manchester, holds a research position with Future Research Labs Changist, and together with Tobias Revel is co-organizer of Haunted Machines, a project interrogating narratives of magic and technology, including a mini-conference with Future Everything Festival in 2015.
Cool, thank you. So I'm going to try and juggle 3 different pieces of equipment. Is that working? Can you hear me?
Just.
Okay, I'll try and shout and project. So Haunted Machines is a conference that looked at narratives of magic and technology, primarily at where narratives of technology are used to either tell us about the anxieties we have about technology or explore, use them to explore them. So I'm quite interested in the idea of ghost stories in particular because they do reveal or can be an interesting way of us to explore our anxieties around technology, where the pipes are creaking and tell us what our technology is doing and what it potentially could do. My Kindle's just gone off, so obviously I'm being haunted by my own technology. Fantastic. So I'm going to use a few sort of really ham-fisted contemporary narrative and gestures to kind of signpost these and look at where ghosts exist in 2 particularly personal algorithmically mediated spaces, which is a social network and the home. So during the Victorian times, there was a lot of really great, weird stuff that happened around the Industrial Revolution, because if you're looking at the things that we are really nervous about and kind of anxious about with technological process, this is the Boston medium, Marjorie, and she was the subject of Houdini's, I think it's like £5,000 debunking scheme, where he challenged anyone to come up to him and say, if you can prove that you're spiritual, I'll give you £5,000. And they went through a really crazy, rigorous amount of testing involving him creating a lot of technological devices to debunk the ones that she was using herself that she claimed spiritual. And you have things like ghost stories of like Edgar Allan Poe, where you have the telltale heart, which actually reveals something about us not being able to know where things are coming from. And then, interestingly, in the next sort of, fast forward about 60, 70 years, this is a really stupid idea, the juggling, sorry. You kind of have the 50s where everything was about the future and being in science fiction and rocketing yourself into a sort of future present which didn't quite exist. And then suddenly in the 80s, this kind of thing happened. Which is probably my favourite possible advert ever, which is a Honeywell literally going, what is it? Electronic mail, magic, and everyone does a lot of hand waving, not like you guys twinkling, but like literal hand waving about what it is. And these are kind of strange narratives which make us want to sort of be at the head of our own magic. And things like Apple's slogan, which is it just works. You don't need to have to kind of worry that it kind of how it works, but that just that it does, and you don't really know what you're letting yourself into when you use it. And you essentially become like the magical assistant, but not even the magical assistant, the person who's brought on stage in the audience to show how clever the magician is. So this kind of rubbish, try not to swear, like you're more powerful than you think, is like a massively powerful obfuscation technique. It makes you think that you're doing the magic when actually you're the component. So with kind of algorithmically mediated culture, we see where the problems of sort of agency and control and intent really create the capacity for ghosts to haunt us. And this narrative, even though it's being used by certain powers like this, it's quite interesting for us to look at as a way to explore why this is difficult for us. Things like Rita Parsons, who was, she was bullied horrifically and she took her own life. And her image, because of the third-party image scraping algorithms that are used on Facebook and across sort of media channels and all sorts of things, eventually it was kind of collected into the data bank of a third-party advertiser. And it appeared months later in a Canadian dating advert on Facebook. And obviously her dad and her family were incredibly horrified that this was here, and I mean rightfully so. And when things like this happen, we kind of don't imagine that something or someone is there. So we do imagine that someone's there to prevent this behaviour, and we don't anticipate that this decision was governed by an algorithm operating relatively blindly, instructed to kind of gather images of women from a specific kind of demographic or context. Because essentially algorithms don't know the context of a photograph, they don't understand or preempt the kind of consequences of their own function, but they don't have our faulty methodology, but we have our faulty application. and in that way the algorithm is almost blameless. So this kind of consistent failure to understand those wider systems at work means that it's kind of algorithms becoming this appropriated technology and this kind of ghost in some respects. Because as kind of Joanne McNeill says in her paper on being kind of haunted by algorithms, we're subject to an algorithmic gaslighting, essentially, kind of where the algorithm is boxing you into a past while you're trying to move on, and we're kind of reminded of moments that we didn't want served back to us because we didn't want to see. And this is Tom Scott, who the language itself is kind of a bit terrifying. It's like, oh, we're sorry that we showed you a memory that you didn't want to see. You won't see it in this newsfeed again, but the fact that this kind of process happens is absolutely kind of terrifying to me. And there's things like, because we don't really know where our images and our content's going to be, there's things like the Unfriended movie, which you've probably seen the trailer for this. I haven't seen it because it's not out here or there. But in this story, this like dead woman haunts her friends through various social media channels, like by kind of popping up and her pictures are going to be here, but this is a bit more active because she literally like Skype calls them, kills them through some means, I'm not sure. But it's not that different to how death kind of operates in social media spaces, because, I mean, as we all know, that unfortunately friends of ours do die, and their content, if we can't access it immediately, kind of gets fed into the system. And you have things like the ghost in the machine language and this kind of thing where you'll click or you'll like something and it'll say, oh, your friend who died 2 years ago and no one's thought to phrase in the profile also likes this thing, and you're like, oh great, that's fantastic, brilliant, Facebook, thanks for that. So we're kind of looking at the past sense and looking at those kind of traditional ghost stories. You'll hear the accounts of those spectres that do follow you around and knock over things in your house, and in this case kind of disrupt the environment that you're making online for yourself, enacting emotional violence in this role as a digital poltergeist. I mean, the problem is that you don't really see it until it does break, or until you notice it, and once you notice it, you don't know what to do. Do you get the exorcist in? Who is the exorcist in this respect? And you become powerless almost, and like there's going to look back to this idea of personal spaces. This happens in the home as well. I mean, as a kind of personal space, the retrofitted sort of smart kitchen or smart home, or somewhere where you put this digital system into your house, can become, once you leave, an algorithmically populated tomb of like needs and wants and aspirations and the things that you liked and you wanted. And there's this kind of concept of the stone tape theory by Thomas Charles Lethbridge, which is this theory that a life can be recorded into the stone of your house and can be replayed at certain emotional triggers. So if there's a death or an earthquake or someone has a fight or something. But when you kind of put systems like cables and software and things into the home, you're literally giving your house the ability to record itself. So that means it could potentially play it back at some point. So your shopping and your temperature preferences and your conversations, if you think about things like the always listening technology of Samsung's television and Amazon Echo and all sorts of things, they're always listening and acting upon some day-to-day life. And while you're living in it, you're kind of inviting these house guests in. I mean, you aren't guessing what you want to put in your fridge, or allowing you to haunt your loved ones that actually happen to be dead, like people who switch off the temperature in their wife's house because they think that the house is too warm or something like that. And they make it really hostile when you act against the recorded behaviours. I mean, everyone's heard of like the kind of very relative stories about your credit card not working because algorithmically it didn't anticipate you being in that place. So it's like, no, you can't have any money because we didn't think you're going to be going on a holiday on a romantic getaway to Berlin or whatever. And it used to be that your house kind of was where you went to shut people out, but you're kind of shutting systems in and allowing them to haunt in that respect. And kind of going back to the more sort of extreme cases, because like having your credit card shove out at an airport is quite a privileged position. But when you have things like the story of Michelle Catalano and her husband who became the target of a visit by federal officers because of Google search results, which is things like their son was searching bombings. They also looked at backpacks and a pressure cooker, and somehow, even though the NSA denied having any sort of involvement or data or search history of average citizens, just showed up at the house and were like, okay, can we check your computers, can we check your house, that sort of thing. And even though you can, when you vacate it potentially in this system and you leave this system that's been moderating your behaviour, even when you hard reset your kitchen, the profile you've built up could sort of still exist if current kind of cloud-based technologies are anything to go by. You have things like stacks of temporary files that mount up on each other, like literally like layers of sediment, because they're going to freeze and stop when they kind of collect it. And there's an artist called Wesley Goatley. I've just missed the best slide, sorry. An artist called Wesley. Yeah, sorry. Just a few more seconds. But Wes Goatley, in his project Wireless Fidelity, which is this block which is sonifying SSIDs and Wi-Fi networks as you walk around a city, on the last day I was speaking to him and his boxes stopped working because a file on the USB Wi-Fi adapter had filled up with temporary data and metadata. Now, looking at it, he kind of found that you can't access it unless you have a very specialist knowledge to even know to look for what to diagnose that problem. It's not that you don't know how to diagnose it, but that's the problem in the first place, because you don't know where you see these things build up. Therefore, with these sort of algorithm-mediated systems, you won't know where to look out for when your power is being removed and where you can stop it unless you know where to look. I mean, with a house, you kind of know where to tighten the leaking tap, but not necessarily why your fridge is misunderstanding or assuming your behaviour or letting your behaviour out of your house and how to stop it. I mean, it's that whole sort of idea of who really shifts and who lays the burden here. I mean, when we think of the reappropriation of Clarke's law, I mean, something that Tobias, who organised Quantum Machines with me, said was that any sufficiently advanced hacking is indistinguishable from a haunting. But is it really the hackers essentially that we have to worry about when we have companies and organisations using algorithms and backdoors and enabling bias and prejudiced mode of search in our homes, which should be the spectre we worry about, because the NSA and GCHQ and systems like that position themselves as friendly ghosts that are there to protect us and to watch out for us. And if anything happens, it's okay guys, we've got your back, we'll get rid of them. But actually, as we know, their supposed benevolence isn't really something that we can count on. And in that respect, it's not too far to stretch or imagine that your house will gaslight you, kind of giving you up. And I don't mean like the shiny sort of smart kind of product vision videos that you have, but things that could be worked into the building by landlords that really want to know what you're doing in there. I mean, they could put sensors in there, could be all sorts of things, and cut off your electricity and kind of watch you subletting that extra room. And smart technologies are kind of the realm of the rich and powerful, and they essentially place themselves as the necromancers, and they're the ones that are raising the ghosts that we encounter. So, kind of, yeah, this is from Ghostbusters. Bush opens the fridge and there's like the hell mouth inside. And this is kind of what we're looking at. It's not this shiny so I can get a calorie-controlled meal. It's like, my fridge is literally messing with me. So a lot of ghost narratives, so kind of what now? I mean, the thing with ghost narratives is that in a lot of ghost narratives, the ghost goes away. And it kind of gets exercised or given closure in the case of Ghost, where they have like a really romantic scene and he goes back into the ether wherever he comes from. But we haven't kind of pretty much realised that algorithmic kind of culture is not going to go away because our contemporary networks are built on it. I mean, there are things we can do to obstruct and confuse it by fuzz testing it and flooding the data, but how do we really understand the longevity and future of algorithmic mediation, which is something that I'm kind of interested in as a future perspective. There's a few examples of this kind of behaviour. There's a very famous film, relatively famous, that came out about a year ago, so I've been told not to spoil it. But if you know what I'm talking about, you'll get the reference. If you don't, you'll still get the reference. But there's a ghost that haunts a house, basically, and they realise at the end of it that they literally can't get rid of it because that there's no way to. So they're going to keep it in the basement, they feed it occasionally, they know that they have to leave the house when it's being fed, it's Australian. It's a really great film. It's a really interesting way of dealing with compromise and knowing how to have power or assert power over things that are kind of horrible to you. And things like in Beetlejuice, that a good friend Georgina Voss mentioned, who's here in the front row. They're like in Beetlejuice, there's this ridiculous scene where they actually accept the ghosts and cause her sort of really stuffy parents and parents' guests to dance around the house. I'm not going to do that again. So is there a place for sort of invoking hauntings or to understand your role in actually creating these ghosts? Because as kind of Derrida says, because we can't talk about it without Derrida, the ghost remains that which gives one the most to think about and to do. And ghosts really are a kind of constant reminder of the people and, in the case of technology, the systems that came before and after, and what will kind of be there after us. If we kind of abstract this term to mean there were things before you and things after that will become ghosts for others, we can kind of understand our capacity for haunting to allow us a better understanding or to imagine the kind of technological futures that we could possibly want. And where ghosts as a narrative can be potentially helpful, and where we can deliberately insert ghosts into systems to see where there is a capacity for haunting. I'm not saying that I'm getting engineers to write ghost stories, because that's a little bit too idiosyncratic for everyone, but rather kind of advocating for new sort of more complex socio-technical methods that allow us to understand not the potential ghosts that our technology enables, but what could be there in the future. So bringing in kind of anthropologists and artists and people who are looking at futures to help mediate a conversation where the potential and plausible kind of consequences of engineering processes through narratives can be interesting. So what I'm currently exploring at the moment, I missed the slide. Okay, I've messed up somehow. That was supposed to be the Ghost of Christmas Future, as you do. So obviously I'm making ham-fisted references here because this is how we do it in England apparently. So I'm kind of exploring kind of a code-based foresight that allows for cross-disciplinary conversations in engineering to happen, kind of creating near futures and to know where our technology could end up and invoke the ghosts that appear as we lose control. Kind of speculative scenarios and foresight techniques are not a new thing, but I'm wondering whether we can allow engineering into this space to kind of explore the impact of their work because computational systems are not neutral. They have political, cultural and social biases written into their selection and application and are treated as being neutral, unfortunately. And it's not about making the products that will use the algorithms, but exploring the algorithms themselves as something that can be reappropriated and applied and reused and misused. And it's still something I'm kind of working on, but using foresight and futures technique as a way of telling future narratives. So come and speak to me on Twitter, and I'm sorry for that. I'm going to leave you with this image for 10 seconds.
You need to swap computer.
I'm going to see if this works. And then...
Next up, we have Nick Seaver. He is NPSEAVER on Twitter. He is going to be talking about traps, algorithms, and the anthropology of technology.
And he's going to change up the thing.
And changing up the technology.
Sorry.
Nick is a PhD candidate in anthropology at UC Irvine, starting at Tufts in the spring as an assistant professor in the anthropology of science and technology. He's moving to Boston. His research investigates the production of algorithmic recommender systems for music through an ethnographic study of engineers, scientists, and developers in the U.S. In previous work, he studied the history of the player piano.
And did it work?
Did it again? Ooh,
yes.
Nice
oh,
timing.
thank God. All right. Oh, that doesn't work. Okay. All right. Can you guys hear me? Is that okay? All right. I'm a nervous public speaker, so it's great that there are like 1,000 of you in here. Thank you. Thank you for coming. My computer is going to tell me something about a Wi-Fi network that I don't care about, so hold on. Just a second, and we'll just turn off the connection altogether. Okay, cool. Lovely. All right. So, as she said, I'm an anthropologist. This is a kind of anthropology-like talk. I apologize for that, and you're welcome also, I guess. For the last several years, I've been conducting ethnographic fieldwork with the developers of algorithmic music recommendation systems. Normally, I have to explain what these are. Pandora, things like this, and Rdio, Spotify, basically all music streaming services have these. They try to recommend music that you might like. And so I'm going to report on like a tiny bit of this, and I'm going to use the anthropologist prerogative and read a very short thing to you right now. Okay, so on an overcast day in the Bay Area, I was eating lunch with Mike, a longtime engineer at a personalized radio company. I had been living in San Francisco, visiting the offices of music recommendation companies and meeting up with engineers in bars and coffee shops. For the last decade, Mike has been responsible, quote, Mike, it's not actually, Mike has been responsible for his company's recommendation algorithm, the knot of code that decides what song to play next. This decision, Mike told me, is pivotal to the business. Pick the wrong song and your users will leave, pick the right song and they'll stick around. So over the years, his company's algorithm has changed. It used to simply take a seed artist and play similar artists. Now, the quote-unquote algorithm is an elaborate algorithmic system that bundles together dozens of sub-algorithms under a master algorithm. These sub-algorithms try to figure out what kind of listener you are and adjust the recommendations accordingly. So as you listen and the system collects more data, the balance among sub-algorithms may shift. Depending on where, this is a quote, depending on where you are in your lifetime of interaction and experience with us, Mike told me, you get very different music experiences. So long-term users with lots of listening data can get minutely personalized recommendations that take into account years of listening history. But, Mike told me, if you're in your first week of listening to us, we're like, fuck that, play the hits. Play the shit you know they're going to love to get them coming back, get them addicted. In the beginning, I'm just trying to get you hooked. That's story time. So what Mike told me is indicative of a broader trend in recommender systems in music and in other domains, which is this move from there we go. From predictive accuracy to user retention. So if you're familiar with the Netflix prize or how Netflix recommendations used to work, it used to mean that you had made a good recommendation if I say, you're going to like this song 4.5 stars, and then you do like it 4.5 stars. That's good. Now that is a very simple model, as people in this room I'm sure are capable of noticing. And so what's happened, thanks to critiques like the kinds of ones we like to mount now, is a move to user retention, which is a shady proxy for something called user satisfaction. So it's a user-centered metric. What means that you've done a good job is not that you anticipated the the rating correctly, but rather that the person sticks around. So I'm going to call this focus on user retention captivation for reasons that are going to become clear. This is what captivation sometimes looks like. This is a bit of a music technology. Meme. You may recognize this pose from the RDO slide at the beginning. I challenge you to find a music technology company that does not have a woman holding headphones and closing her eyes somewhere on their web presence. Okay, so go forward. Kate Crawford has argued in a publication on the internet that there's a big metaphor gap in how we describe algorithmic filtering. And so based on this fact of a move towards captivation for recommender systems, and I think this is probably true more broadly, but I'm going to stick with recommender systems for now, I suggest that a good metaphor is the trap. And when I say, so I think traps are a useful metaphor because they help us focus our attention on some salient features of algorithmic systems, particularly how the social and the technical interrelate with each other. And there are some helpful tools from Anthropology that, thinking about them as traps, help us. We get some analytical purchase and so on. So when I say traps, I mean like traps, like these things, which are from around the world. They will stab you, they will catch you in a noose, you will drop in a hole, you'll be caught in a net if you're an animal, all of these sorts of things. They're bits of technical ingenuity and bricolage. They seem very not like algorithms, which are about as far away from that pointy, sharp stick circle as you can imagine. These ones are collected from around the world in the Ethnological Museum at Oxford, the Pitt Rivers, so we are in deep anthropology territory, as a warning. It's too late for you, though. So we're going to take a little detour through traps, and I will get you back out. So the anthropology traps that I like the most, is most dear to me, is this article by an anthropologist named Alfred Gell, in which he tries to argue that traps might be considered not as mere artifacts, but as artworks. And so he has a very elaborate argument for why this might be so, which I will not get into here. But he tells a great story in it. So I'm going to sit down and do story time again. Okay, so Gell, in this article, Gell translates a story that was told to the French anthropologist of religion Pascal Boyer by a Cameroonian epic chanter named Zay about the hunting practices of pygmies. So pygmies told Zay, who told Boyer, who told Gell, who told me, and now I'm telling you. Okay, so this is Zay about pygmies. They have a special trap for chimpanzees because chimpanzees are like human beings. When they have a problem, they stop and think about what to do, instead of just running off and crying out. You cannot catch a chimpanzee with a snare, because he does not run away, and thus trap himself in the noose. So the pygmies have devised a special trap with a thread, which catches on the arm of the chimpanzee. The thread is very thin, and the chimpanzee thinks it can get away. So instead of breaking the thread, it pulls on it very gently, to see what will happen then. That's my guess. At that moment, the bundle with the poisoned arrow falls down on it because it does not run away like a stupid animal, like an antelope would. Okay, so Gell has some very interesting points to make out about traps, about which I'm going to show you a few, and I'm going to just drill down on one. So he says that traps can be regarded as texts on animal behavior. So these traps that are illustrated like this are all from this 1909 ethnological report on Central Africa. We can talk about some of the politics of representation here if we want in the Q&A, but it's probably beside the point for right now. This trap captures birds that peg at the ground and get tangled in those strings, and then you can pull them up like that. This trap catches fish that like to swim upstream and eat the snacks that are in there, and they get flung up into the air once they break the string. So Gell writes that traps communicate the idea of a nexus of intentionalities between hunters and prey animals via material forms and mechanisms. So traps are critically the conjuncture of a relationship. They're this sort of technical meeting point of hunters and prey, or we might think in recommender systems of sort of the developers of these systems and their users. We'll get back to the real recommender stuff soon. So the takeaway is that you can read traps as a kind of hunting story. This trap catches antelope that run through trees, and they embody ideas, convey meanings, because traps are transformed representations of their makers. You don't have to have a hunter hiding behind the tree to throw a net on the antelope. The trap sort of delegates the hunter's agency into the environment. And then, last and sort of most fun, traps, he writes, are lethal parodies of the animal's Umwelt. And this is a quote from him. Thus, the rat that likes to poke around in narrow spaces has just such an attractive cavity prepared for its last fateful foray into the dark. So if you're not familiar with Umwelt, it's the sort of the cognized environment of the animals. So like rats experience the world in one way, and this is designed to sort of get animals that experience in that way trapped. So this Umwelt is not necessarily, objectively what the Umwelt of the animal is, but it's what the designer thinks it is. Oh yeah, and so for the Heideggerians in the room, there's something to be said about the fact that keeping people on the service is often called dwell time. So the goal is to increase dwell time by parodying the Umwelt. Okay, we're not going to... There are any Heideggerians here, that's okay. Probably good. Okay, so I'm going to drill down more specifically on this idea that traps can be regarded as texts on animal behavior, because I think it's very important for understanding how recommender systems qua traps get made. So here are some examples. Okay, good. So this box of donuts has a particular kind of creature to be trapped in mind. This floor pie similarly has something in mind. So now, from my own fieldwork, something that comes up very often among music recommendation developers is this idea of what different kinds of listeners are like. So they're very sensitive to the idea that different listeners listen differently. So this is a common critique that they receive from the outside, and it's a critique that totally misses the point that obviously they know there are different kinds of listeners, because this is like the biggest problem they have. But the question is, how do they vary, right? Not just whether they're different. So the way that they vary, according to many of the people I've talked to, is like this. It's in terms of their avidity for music. This is from a regrettably titled book called Net Blogs and Rock and Roll. But it's from a UK media survey of music listeners. And so at the top you have savants. These are people who quote unquote live for music. They're really into it. The people who build music recommender systems tend to be or think that they are in that system or in that level. Then it sort of goes down in enthusiasm to the bottom, where you find the indifference. And sometimes they call these people the Starbucks listeners, because the idea is that like in the past you would have just picked up whatever was on the counter at Starbucks because you just don't give a fuck. You're just like, whatever, I don't care. Just play me. So it's an interesting problem, right? Is that the indifferents, as you can see, are the bulk of the potential market for these things, but they don't care. And so recommenders already operate in this weird territory, right? Which is like, I want to listen to music, but I don't really want to pick it. And so you can sense this sort of ambivalence. And indifferents have this ambivalence the most. You might argue they have no ambivalence, they just don't care. But nonetheless, we would like to trap them. The question is, how do you trap them? Well, okay, we can sort of see this. The idea is that indifferents are unwilling to put in any effort to find music. This is definitionally what it means to be indifferent to music. And so if you want to capture them, you need to be aware that unlike, say, a chimpanzee, which is going to go through your system and pull the gnats out of its hair and figure out whatever, they're going to do no interactions. This is numbers of interactions. So like the cool people or whatever will go around and they'll find their MP3 blogs and do whatever. The indifferents will do nothing. They want to do nothing. Maybe they'll like press a button that's like music button. And so what's happened in this, and usually what ends up happening is that they group together casuals and indifferents and sort of split this in half, and we call one lean forward listeners and one lean back listeners. So we can also say, how do we capture a lean back listener? Okay, so they're not willing to do anything for you. So what do? Well, you try to make them interact with you inadvertently. And that's by using signals sort of like these, right? So these are things that variously can either be directly collected from a sensor, they can be taken from your profile on social media, they can be inferred from stuff we know, algorithms, right? Okay. So they can get this stuff together. If I like throw my phone across the room, they're like, oh, maybe he's working out, and they're gonna play like a banging EDM something. So the point is that this idea about the indifferent listener involves building these traps for trapping them that have all of this branching data collection like mania happening. And so a lot of people probably in this room care about the proliferation of this kind of data collection. And we can contextualize it in terms of techno-capitalism, in terms of surveillance by the government, and these are important things to contextualize it in terms of. But as an anthropologist, I'm interested in why does this make sense to the people who build them? Because the implication of a lot of, or the sort of assumption of a lot of outside critique is if only these people knew, like, didn't you realize, man, you're in the service of techno-capital and the NSA, then they would do something else. And what I'm suggesting is that no, they're actually in the trap-making industry. And so if you want to make them change what they're doing, it would help to actually intervene in these systems as traps and to sort of say, your user imaginaries that have people being indifferent and whatever, maybe there are different ways to slice up the world and those would result in different kinds of traps and so on. So the last useful thing that traps bring us to is the question of ethics, right? So calling these traps is a pretty loaded thing to do, obviously, where no one is getting stabbed in the eye by Pandora or have your leg trapped in the thing. And what I want to suggest is that by thinking of these as traps, we can move the kinds of critiques that we make of recommender systems from the very common critique, which I swear one of you is going to come up to me after and be like, my Pandora doesn't work, from the critique of the systems as, well, they just don't work very well as what they do. So this is a critique on accuracy. And it's a critique that doesn't make any sense if you're talking about a trap. You don't say, this rat trap is an inaccurate representation of the umwelt of the rat. So it moves to this other question, which is, how do these systems get built? How does power inflect the construction of traps? How does knowledge circulate about both sides of the trapping operation? And so on. So just to get into one last bit of it, I have time, this is cool. So I'm gonna, thank you. So I'm just gonna put this up here. This is from that Alfred Gell article. There's a rule that a certain kind of anthropologist can't use pictures and they have to draw everything. So this is a drawing of the Damien Hirst's, what's it called? The physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living? Yeah, okay. So okay, so there's two kinds of captivation going on here, right? One is the bodily captivation of the shark in the vitrine. The other is this shady fellow who's captivated by the artwork. And so the important thing that I want to give to you, this is sort of a conceptual tool gifting, is think of everything as traps, okay? Also, think about captivation, and it's useful to remember the sort of etymological blending of physical captivation and mental captivation, because we usually separate them, right? But there are reasons to recover this weird in-betweenness between being physically captured and mentally captured, which are made evident in work like this by Natasha Dauschul from STS, where she talks about machine gamblers. And she writes these are quotes of her from her informants, I think. Something sinister was at work here, enticing normal people into a snare, or when I gamble, I feel like a rat in a trap. So I'm not suggesting that people are becoming addicted to Pandora or something, and the reason that we have to care about these ethically is because of addiction, but rather that by reopening this middle space between physical and mental captivation, we can think newly about these things. So captivation is not necessarily bad, it's a general condition of social life, so don't sweat it. I have been trying to captivate you here, but now I'm going to let you go. Thanks.
So do you want to grab the other mic down there? So we will start with questions from the audience. I, as moderator, will take moderator's prerogative with the first question. And I will be walking around the room with the mic for people to ask questions. The thing that I find across all of this work is the larger question of okay, well, then what are we actually optimizing for? Most of the kind of critique is actually getting down to is it doing the thing that it's supposed to be doing? Especially in the case of the kind of machine learning image recognition. Okay, image recognition to what end, right? Why are we image recognizing, and what are the stakes of the images that don't accurately meet that? To what end, right? So I'm going to kind of start with Solon. And
I have no adequate answer for that. Yeah, I mean, so I'm actually, I think, deeply sympathetic to Nick's argument, and in fact, in my own work, I say something similar in a different context, where what it invites us to think about is what it invites us to think about, I think, is the definition of the problem that you're solving, and I think that's the question you're posing too. And so it's sometimes interesting to think about, well, what problem is Google solving? by figuring out a way to automate the process of identifying like cats in photos, right? And I mean, there's a simple answer, which is like they can now like add tags and like semantic information to images and make it possible to actually query them in some meaningful way. But it's also like curious to think like, well, even then, like, what is the point? Like, what is Google's interest in doing that? And I don't know, I have like no particularly insightful answer to offer to that question. But I do think that that like recognizing how the definition of the problem can like set us down a particular path, and that when we accept that path as the only terrain on which we can actually critique, then we get into this problem of like not actually asking these questions. And even though you're asking that question, I'm going to.
Anyone else want to take a shot?
Sure. So I think there's something sort of connected actually in what Daniel had said about the sort of what works versus what is true question about algorithms. And I think that one thing I like about thinking about them as traps is that it recenters the sort of pragmatics of all of this algorithmic stuff, right? So it takes us out of the question of, can algorithms really know anything? Do we really know anything? What is, what's going on? And into a, like, what is it? Yeah, exactly. And what is it? So what is into a question of what is it like to interact with these systems? What comes out of their interaction? And so, for me, replacing with a material metaphor is very useful for doing that. For other people, I'm sure there are other ways. But this question of like, okay, let's just talk about working and interaction rather than accuracy, adequacy, all of these sort of like philosophical rat traps from the past, bajillion years.
I do love the metaphor of the trap, and then I think the next question is, well, what are you trapping someone for? I mean, you can trap someone to let them free, you can trap someone to bundle them on an aeroplane and then release them into the wild and where they're supposed to be. We can trap someone for terrible ends. So that's the kind of question, why are we doing this? And if it's just for the benefits of capitalism, for to further the ends of the system, then maybe that's not the reason. I mean, I think the trap's a really great metaphor, but
Well, it is kind of the hoodwink and the misdirection, like, oh, we want to show you this thing because we want to help you, and like, this is going to be fantastic for you, but actually this is telling us about your behaviours and who you are as a person, so that we can capitalise that and put it into a third-party service. Because there is this misdirection here, it is the kind of for whom, by whom thing that kind of anthropologists and STS likes to bring on all the time, but it's a really important question we need to ask, not just on a technical level, but on a socio-technical level.
So other questions from the audience?
I think that's about chocolate, right? That pocket trap?
This one here?
Yeah.
This is my bad memory now. I think so, yes.
Okay. So that's a pre-question, not the actual question.
Thank you.
Because if we think about traps as for animals that have an umvelt, right, that we're trying to trap a raptor that we know is going to interact with us in some way, and you have this model of interactions for music, Savas, Hashmod, etc. But that's pretty sort of essential as well, right? There's sometimes that you want to interact, or sometimes you just want music in the background. So I'm interested in asking you how music recommendation engines deal with the fact that people are not Seavers, raptors, otters,
right.
And then more broadly asking the rest of the group how algorithms deal with the fact that people are not necessarily as constant as animals are in themselves.
Great, thank you, no, that's perfect. So there's a little bit of oversimplification in the way that I presented this, which is that it's very common for people to say, okay, there are lean forward and lean back listeners, and then the most sort of sensitive people who I've talked to, who mercifully are most of my informants will say this, is, well, there's not a lean back person or a lean forward person, there are lean back and lean forward situations. If you're at the gym, you want one thing. If you're at home, you want another thing, this kind of idea. So that's very popular. And the idea then would be, okay, so sure, an individual can move through there. And then the umvelt idea starts to fall apart a little bit because it's sort of situational. But again, this is a situation where moving towards that critique and trying to solve that critique means that, okay, well, what are we going to do about that? Well, why don't we draw on more of the sensors in the phone to figure out whether you are this kind of person or that kind of person? So we have a similar problem with, John Cheney-Lippold has talked about this in the algorithmic modulation in personalization, which is that yes, finally, you can have a fluid, quote-unquote, identity on Facebook. Now you can enter a free text gender identity, but now there's just new ways to get sort of encapsulated by systems. So what I want to suggest is there's not really an escape from that, and I think that aiming for total escape from that is going to aim us also for suffering and lack of success, but that this engagement with this system is sort of what we need to be doing.
Maybe by way of an answer, I mean, when we consider this triangle between the programmers, the users, capitalism, whatever it is, but there's a recent article by Benjamin Bratton who calls for us to think about artificial intelligences possibly not being what we want them to be, not being human, not being understandable. The fact is that we have set ourselves in motion into a system that perpetrates what it is to be human. I mean, I'm going to go back to this kind of grand narrative of the Anthropocene, the death of the planet, climate change, whatever it is. We have, as humans, done damage to the planet. Therefore, the idea that we can program our systems around us and to tell us about the data to mediate that world in some way that's going to help us ascend beyond that, emancipate ourselves from the climate change is kind of nonsensical. So maybe we need to think about intelligences that aren't human, that are going to do things for their own ends. Let's program an algorithm that's like, no, screw the humans, it's planet comes first, and then the whole of capitalism gets built on top of that, if we can imagine such a thing.
Great, so I want to make sure we get one more question from the audience, and then we'll check in Twitter.
Jeremy, you talk about ghost people. Talk about ghosts, and you talked a bit about power and land political things in code, and people generally, your devices generally doing things that you don't like. I'm wondering how the analogs exist in our stories. What stories are people using causing voices or antagonistic people commanding ghosts to do things, or how does power play out in ghost stories?
Sorry, could I didn't retake the question because there was a bit of an interruption with the speakers. No, it's fine. So kind of looking at where stories have create or enact power, or
where the power lies historically in a ghost story.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So the kind of the power essentially lies in the hands. Oh, I'm subject to crowd noise. The power tends to lie in the idea of the wizard and the person who controls or enacts the magic upon, like the villagers or the people who are there. And this is kind of always impetus with designers, so the idea of like the designer wizard or the designer god. We have things like the wizard that's in your computer telling you and helping you what to do and saying, oh, what to do down this path and that kind of thing. But it's kind of a grand assumption and quite a general kind of thing to say, but the idea of having power, being able to enact power, but almost kind of weird not knowing the power that you're doing is going to be harmful to someone. So you kind of think, oh, I'm solving this problem by enacting this particular magic upon this system, without realising that this particular magic might actually end up someone having their house searched by the police, that sort of thing. And in stories, it's usually the wizard or the necromancer. And there's a really interesting narrative around gender in stories as well, where the male is the kind of fakir or the wizard, and the woman is the witch, and she's a kind of oracle in the cave. So that's kind of the conversation that maybe not for today, but
I think we'll wrap up since we're fighting the finish over there. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. If you have questions, follow up, talk to them, and everyone's on Twitter. So.
We did it.
you didn't make a Star Wars joke. Well